Hello, and welcome to the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum's live public programming. My name is Kara, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Museum, located in New York City, where today we're going to be talking about jobs on deck. Right? Now, just as a reminder, the museum's live programs are free, but if you'd like to support us in delivering this amazing content, please click the link located in the chat or in the comments. Now, feel free to use the chat and tell us where you're tuning in from. Have you ever been to the Intrepid Museum before? Or if you'd like to participate and ask questions as well. Again, my name is Kara, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where our motto is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire the youth. So let's get started. So I am coming to you, like I said, from the Intrepid Museum, located on the west side of New York, right in between New York and New Jersey in the Hudson River. What makes our museum really special is that it's located inside of a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. Now, just a couple of neat things about Intrepid. It's really long. The Intrepid's about 913 feet long. If you were playing football on top, you could play 3 games of football at the same time. That's how massive it is. If you're walking down the West Side Highway, you can't miss us. We are huge, right? If you were to take the Intrepid, tilt it on its side, it's almost as tall as a New York City skyscraper. Now, from that tallest point on Intrepid to that lowest deck, it's about 8 stories tall. So like I said, you can't miss us. We are huge. Now, the Intrepid began its construction in 1943, 6 days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, finished about 18 months later. Now, Intrepid served during World War II, the Vietnam, and the Cold War, but also acted as a recovery vessel for NASA in the 1960s. Now, at the time, it was still really difficult and almost impractical to get these airplanes to fly all across the ocean. So can anybody tell me in the chat what this type of vessel is called that can carry aircrafts across the ocean? What type of ship is the Intrepid? And I mentioned it earlier in the beginning. What type of ship would be able to carry these aircrafts and also have them launch and land as well? Let me know in the chat. So if you were thinking aircraft carrier, you'd be on the right track, right? Like I said, not only did Intrepid carry these airplanes, but these airplanes were able to launch and land just like an airport. It's kind of like a floating airport right in the middle of the sea. So the Intrepid served from 1943 to 1974 before coming the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in 1982. So I'm going to take us inside of the museum, where we're going to stop at our chairs exhibit. Now, what's really cool about these chairs is they tell a very interesting story about what life might have been like on board of Intrepid while it was in service, right? So tell me in the chat if you can find a chair in this group here that's kind of boring, or maybe not boring, but maybe ordinary. We'll use the word ordinary. Tell me in the chat if you can find a chair that's pretty ordinary. Maybe you've seen one just like it before, maybe at school, at home, at an office. Any one of these chairs that you think is just kind of usual, right? If you would have said this green chair, we would have been on the same track, right? Now, on board Intrepid, there were a lot of physical jobs, but there were also jobs that required a lot of sitting, right? This is a type of chair that you would find just about anywhere on board. It can be found in offices, the mess deck, and other places where you'd find like radar operators, radio men, and all kinds of administrative personnel. Now, remember, Intrepid was out at sea sailing. So a lot of thought went into the design when they were creating this chair, right? It had to be light enough that you can pick it up with ease and move it around. But you also didn't want it to be so light that if a big wave came and hit the ship, it was going to be kind of scooching around the floor, right? You wanted it to be able to stay in one place. So as much as it kind of looks like a boring old chair, a lot of thought and design went into it. Now, next I want you to tell me which chair here looks the coziest. Let me know in the chat which chair you think is the coziest chair. Maybe it's very comfortable. You can see yourself curling up on it, kind of putting your feet up. Let me know in the chat, which one do you think is pretty comfortable? Kind of a cozy chair. So if you would have said this brown one here, we would have been on the same wavelength, right? This chair would be found in the pilot ready room. And basically when these pilots would spend hours in this room getting ready, preparing for their assignments and their missions. So they'd spend a lot of time in here, and they'd have to have their chairs be pretty comfortable, right? They also had a desk attachment that could also swivel up to the top, and they could use it to write on it. But if you look closely, you can see at the bottom there, they have some compartments that they could also store their stuff in, their materials. Now, today you can find the ready room and see what it would have looked like in the 1960s and 70s on board Intrepid today. So going back to our chairs here, can anybody tell me a chair that makes them feel a little intimidated, or maybe it's a little scary to them? One that looks just really uncomfortable, maybe, that you wouldn't want to take a ride in? Any of these chairs, let me know in the chat if one just looks, maybe just makes you feel uneasy. You might have said this chair here, and can anybody in the chat tell me where you think you might find this chair? It's inside of another vehicle on board Intrepid. I'll give you a little hint there. Let me know in the chat if you know where you might find this chair used by a pilot. So if you said an ejection seat, you'd be correct, and you'd find this inside of an airplane. Right? Now, this seat would be found inside the airplane, and Intrepid could hold about 100 airplanes at any time between the flight deck and the hangar deck. These chairs could be found inside of jets that came a little bit later after World War II. And basically, if the pilot was in a bind, he'd be able to pull that lever at the top there, or the one in between his legs, and basically this small explosive, or the small bomb, would go underneath and actually make him shoot out of that airplane, right? Now, the seat would separate from the pilot, and the pilot would be able to let out his parachute, and he'd be able to float back down, landing in the water where it's softer than probably landing on the ground, right? So let's say that we have this pilot. He learned about his mission. He got his assignment in the pilot ready room. He got into his airplane, he got into a bind, he had to make a quick getaway, and now he's in the middle of the ocean. And Intrepid is really far away. So let's say that he's picked up by another friendly ship, and they call the Intrepid and say, hey, we have your pilot, come pick him up. Let me know in the chat if you know which chair would help him get from that ship back to Intrepid. Let me know in the chat if you can point out which chair might help that pilot get from one ship to the other. So if you said this chair, the Highline chair down at the end, you'd be correct. But if you're still wondering, how is this chair going to move this pilot, right? It would look a little something like this. What are some things that you notice automatically about this picture? Let me know in the chat. I, for one, notice the waves down at the bottom are crashing into each ship. That makes me very uncomfortable because I am very afraid of the ocean. So you can see that basically this would work like a zip line. If we look at our chairs, again here, you can see that there's that little circle at the top, and you'd have that cable go through that circle, and you'd basically take a ride from one ship to the other. Like I said, this makes me very uncomfortable because I'm very afraid of the ocean, but these ships would actually be moving, right? So you'd have these ships moving, and you need to make sure that they are going at the same speed, right? If one goes too fast, that line might get pulled a little bit. If they go too far, you're going to have too much line going. If they get too close, that pilot might be dunked into the water. So you'd have to be very careful when you're kind of ziplining from one ship to the other. right? There's a really interesting, funny story that we like to tell at the museum where there was this ship that had picked up one of Intrepid's pilots, and this pilot needed to get back to Intrepid. So that ship tells Intrepid, hey, we heard you have ice cream. Can you send us over some ice cream in exchange for your pilot? And Intrepid was like, sure, wink, wink. So they actually take the ice cream and they weigh it down with soap shavings and they send it across. The ship didn't like it very much. So as they sent the pilot over, the ship actually moved a little bit closer, dunking that pilot in the water and getting him wet. I feel bad for the pilot. I don't think he deserved that, but it's all fun and games, right? Awesome. So going back to our chairs here, can anybody tell me where they've seen this chair before? You might have thought that this was the intimidating chair or maybe the scary chair. I certainly did think it was the scary chair. But if you look really close here, you might have seen this chair at the dentist, right? Now, these men were on board for 6 to 9 months. That's plenty of time to get a cavity, a toothache. There was a whole dental department on board. You could also get a cleaning. They did dentures as well and minor surgeries because that's plenty of time to get a toothache if you're on board for 6 to 9 months. Right? There were also barbers on board. The Navy had a very strict dress code. They wanted everybody to look a certain way. So there was always a barber on board to make sure that everybody had a nice, clean haircut. Awesome. So if there's any questions, this is a good time to take a question break. How many people served on Intrepid? So there was about 3,200 men on board of the ship. Like I said, they were on board for about 6 to 9 months. And these men were anywhere between 18 to about 23 years old. So they were very young. A lot of the time, this was the first time that they were leaving home, right? It was a really big deal. And it was kind of scary, too, to be leaving home for the first time at such a young age. And like I said, there was about 3,200 men on board. Good question. Any more questions? What other common jobs could you find on Intrepid? Oh, so aside from having really intense jobs like pilots, right, and the captain, you had jobs like a dentist and a barber. There was also a post office on board too. Again, this is the time of no internet, no email, so you'd have to use snail mail. So there was a post office on board. You've got postmen. You'd also have, there was a radio station on board where you could listen to music. There was also a general store too. So there were people that ran all of these. So Intrepid was kind of like a city at sea. If you really think about it, everything that you could find in your community, you'd also find on board Intrepid as well. Good questions. So like I said, as you can see, there were all kinds of jobs on board, right? Some of them were very intense, like being pilots, and some were, things that you could find in your community, like dentists and barbers, right? So we're going to take a look at this airplane right here. Right, this is the Tbm Avenger, and it's one of the primary planes of World War II. It's also one of the oldest planes in our collection at the Intrepid Museum. So let me know in the chat if you find anything really interesting about this plane, whether it's the color or its design, its shape. Think about when it was flying and where it flew off of. Let me know in the chat if there's just anything really interesting that you notice about this plane. The first thing that I notice are its folded wings, right? A lot of people think that these might be broken, but if you think about it, this plane is being stored in the hangar deck. And like I mentioned earlier, the Intrepid could hold about 100 airplanes between the flight deck and the hangar deck. So if you were to take these airplane wings and spread them out really wide, it has a wingspan of about 54 feet. If you had 100 of these being, rotated around in the hangar deck, you're going to run into some issues, right? So just imagine that you were going to fold or extend your wings out and you were going to turn side to side. I already can't. I'm running into a wall here. If I go too far, I'm going to hit my computer. But if you take your folded wing or take your wings and you fold them in nice and tight, you do a little circle here, you're not going to hit anything, right? Same thing with these airplanes. They were designed to make more fit in smaller space. So looking at its color, right? As you take a closer look at this picture here, you can see that it's got a white belly, and it's got like a darker shade of blue on top. Think about where these airplanes were flying. They're flying over the ocean, right? And this type of coloring is called counter shading, and it's a way to kind of camouflage, right? So imagine that this plane is flying over you and you're looking up at it. If you see that white belly underneath, it's probably gonna blend in with the clouds, right? If this plane is flying underneath you, it's gonna probably blend in with the ocean, right? And that's because this plane doesn't go very fast. It only travels at about 270 miles per hour. So it's not a very fast plane. You might think it's very fast if you think about it compared to like a car, right? But for this airplane, it's not very fast. It's also very big. It's very bulky. It's also very heavy. If you look underneath it there, it's got a 2,000-pound torpedo that gets housed inside of the belly of the airplane. So this plane is just not very fast, right? And its main job was a torpedo bomber. Basically, this plane lowers down as close as it can get to its target, and it has to drop that torpedo with great accuracy and then get up and fly away. So it's really heavy, it's really bulky, it's not very fast, right? It's even nicknamed the turkey because it's kind of clunky, right? So we know that we have a pilot that's obviously flying this plane, right? Planes are not self-flying, especially during this time. But can anybody in the chat tell me who else might be inside this plane? There were 2 other people that were inside this plane. Tell me in the chat if you know, besides the pilot, what 2 other people would be in here. So remember that its main job was a torpedo bomber. So think about who might be in here with the pilot. And I'll zoom in there for you so you can see it a little bit closer. So you would have the radio operator, right, the pilot, but you'd also have a navigator or a tail gunner, right? And that gunner would sit in this ball turret here. It could rotate 360 degrees around, and that front gun there could actually go up and down. If the crew needed to make a quick getaway, right? Earlier I mentioned that there were ejection seats in some of these planes. Now, ejection seats didn't come out until closer to the Vietnam War during the jet age. So planes like the Avenger that flew during World War II actually didn't have ejection seats. So the pilot and the tail gunner and the navigator would actually have to go into the belly of the plane, get their parachutes on, and actually jump out of the plane. So to me, I don't know which one I would rather fly inside of. One that there's a small explosive that might shoot me out of the top, or one that I've got to manually put my parachute on and jump out of it. Let me know in the chat which one you would rather do. See how many daredevils we have out there. So, of course, if we've got these airplanes that are taking off and landing, and Intrepid's out at sea for 6 to 9 months, you're going to have mechanics on board, right? And if you take a look at this picture, it really is a group effort, right? You see the man on the propeller there. You see the man on the top part of the body right in front of the window. There's a crew on the bottom, right, that's watching to make sure everything's going well. And there's even a man off to the right there. It looks like he's painting letters on there. So it's really a group effort to keep these planes in top-notch shape, right? They're going off, they're flying, they have this big mission that they have to accomplish. Now, again, we're out at sea. We can't stop at a machine shop and get parts that we need. We need to carry everything with them. Now, on board, there was a repair division, right, whose job was to repair and paint and weld parts of the ship that might need fixing, everything to keep it afloat. There was also an engineering department, but there was also a machine shop on board as well. So there were the men that flew the planes, and there were also the men that fixed the planes as well, all the mechanics on board. So moving to the most further front part of the ship here, we're in this special room located at the very front of the ship. Now, looking at this picture here, can anybody tell me where you think what might happen in this room? Just taking in some observations about what these long pieces are, what they're wrapped around. Let me know in the chat if you know what goes on in this room here. Let me know in the chat. So if you said lowering the anchors or the anchor chain room, you would be correct. Now, the anchors weren't used very often because most of the time the Intrepid could pull up to a port and there'd be a pier there that they could come up against. But in the event that they had to deploy the anchors, it was kind of a big deal, right? So you'd have these anchors that would be located at the far end of those chains here. So I'll reverse there. So you can see that at the far end of those really heavy chains, you'd have these anchors. And these anchors are massive, right? You can see here just the scale of these two men on that anchor is really, really large, right? And I see Bobo Blia there in the comments saying that it could be a really noisy room. Yeah, we'll get into that in just a second. It was really loud in there. So basically, when they were ready to drop anchor, you can see on the right there that these chains are being held in place by a special kind of hook called a pelican hook. Now that pelican hook had a pin in it, and on the picture on the left, you can see that there's a man with a string. He'd pull that pin out of the pelican hook, and that man on the right there would actually use this really large sledgehammer to hit that pelican hook as hard as he could. Now that chain would actually start going using gravity to drop those anchors into the water, right? Now that chain would be wrapped around these pieces right here called wildcats. So if you can imagine that chain unraveling from that wildcat and also going down the steel ship, it could be very, very noisy, right? It could be really loud. It's very clangy in there too. Now imagine that these links, right? Each one of these chain links in this picture here weighs about 150 pounds. Now that's being hurled down to the water by gravity. And then you'd have two men who would actually be on these wheels right here to try and slow them down and to try and use break them, right? To try and get them to break. Right? And so, yeah, Vahanara says the weight of the chain itself is doing most of the job. Yes, but you don't want the whole thing to go down into the water because in the event that all the chain went down with the weight of the anchor, it could actually rip out of the wall. And then you wouldn't be able to get those anchors back, right? So being a sailor operating in the anchor chain room could be a really dangerous job. And like I said, it was really loud as well. So one interesting story that we have about the Intrepid and its anchor chain room was back in 1944. Intrepid was struck by a Japanese torpedo. That torpedo ended up taking out taking out the rudder of Intrepid, right? And they just could not get the ship to steer without it, right? The rudder is really big deal. It actually uses and helps the ship move side to side, right? So without the rudder, they couldn't get the Intrepid to go on its correct course back home. So basically, they looked far and wide all over the Intrepid to see and find if they could find any canvas. They ended up sewing all that canvas material back together, creating this giant sail. Now, during the 1940s, this area of Intrepid was open to the elements. It was completely open, so you didn't have all those walls in there. And they basically created this giant sail that was able to get Intrepid back home. Now, Intrepid was out of commission for about 4 months before coming back into service after it was repaired, after that attack. Awesome. So one neat thing about this room too is that if you come and visit the Intrepid today, you can actually really explore this room. You can touch and feel everything in this room. There's also some really great sailor art that you can see in here from the 1970s. It kind of just makes it feel a little bit more homey, giving it a little bit more of a nice touch as well. Awesome. So if this is a good place to stop and see if we have any questions. Are the anchors still being used today? So no, if you come and visit the Intrepid, you can see that the anchors are actually pulled up outside of the front of it. But during low tide, the Intrepid's actually stuck in the mud. During high tide, it's floating just a little bit, and you can actually hear it kind of like creaking in the ship as well. So no, the anchors aren't being used, but we're also not going to float away. And just in case, we actually have these mooring lines. You can see them in the back there. It's kind of wrapped around a spool. And they're basically just ropes made of nylon that are holding us down to the pier just in case. Good question. How long were the chains? Ooh, so those chains are about 1,000 feet long. So remember, each one of those links is about 150 long, 150 pounds, 1,000 foot chain, and then each anchor at the end weighs about 15 tons. So it's very heavy and very long. Good question. So now that we've taken a look at one of the most dangerous jobs, right? I was talking a little bit about thinking about jobs in your own community. I don't know how many of you have an anchor chain room in your community, but we're going to move down to something a little bit more relatable. We're going to go down to the, oops, there you go, the mess deck here. I really like this picture because it has a little bit of flair. Can only imagine what it's like being on board a ship for 6 to 9 months, feeling those steel walls around you. It's kind of nice to go down to the mess deck or the cafeteria where it's decorated a little bit. Kind of makes you feel a little bit homey. Doesn't make you feel like you're on a ship all the time. Right? So looking at where food is prepared, it's called the galley there. And I want you to let me know in the chat if you see anything interesting about this room, right? Oop. Compare it maybe to your kitchen at home. Do you have equipment like this? If you look in the back there, you can see that there's a giant mixer. Do you have one of those at home? If you're going to make like a pot of macaroni, do you use a pot that big that you see hanging in the middle there? Let me know in the chat. Just make some observations about the galley here. Like I said, how different is it from your room at home, right? So looking at the galley here, like I said, you could see that the equipment is massive, right? The galley crew worked about 15 hours a day. Like I said earlier, there was about 3,200 men on board. Multiply it times 3 for 3 meals a day. Think about how much food has to be made in this deck, right? The mixer has to be large. You can't just make 1 hamburger or 10 hamburgers at a time. You have to make a lot of food, right? They would make 700 loaves of bread in 1 day. It's a lot of bread, right? And thinking a lot about the way that these were cooked, if you look at the picture here on the left, you can see that they just didn't make 10, 15 pieces of meat. There was a lot of meat being made at the same time. We're going to look at a couple of recipe cards later, but anytime anything was made, the portions were made for about 100 people, right? Because everything was made in these really large batches. They had all kinds of celebrations like Christmas or holidays, like Christmas and Thanksgiving. Like I said, to just make the crew feel a little more at home. Kind of boosted morale, right? But we also celebrated things like Intrepid's commissioning, landing aircrafts safely, but also celebrating astronauts as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that we are the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, and it's because Intrepid helped recover astronauts during the 1960s. During Project Gemini, Intrepid picked up Gus Grissom and John Young, and it was a really big deal, right, to have astronauts on board. And we had this big celebration because, like I said, it was a huge deal to have these astronauts on board Intrepid. If you take a closer look at this picture here, you can see that they're not just using regular old knives to cut this big cake, right? They're using military sabers because it's a huge cake. And like I said, it was a really big deal. So cakes like this took a lot of ingredients and a lot of time, right? Looking at a cake like this, it was actually made of a lot of mini cakes, right? Could you imagine trying to put this giant cake in a giant oven and cooking it? So it's actually made of a lot of smaller cakes. And a cake like this, like I said, was made of a lot of mini cakes. And each of those cakes would have a recipe card like this. So this is for an easy chocolate cake. If you look at the top left-hand corner there, it says that it yields about 100 portions. So they would have to think about how many people were they trying to feed, right? divided by 100 portions to figure out how many of these cakes they'd have to make. If you take a closer look at this recipe card, you can see that it takes 4 pounds of flour and 4¼ pounds of sugar. So that is a lot of flour and a lot of sugar. I don't know if you're not a massive baker at home, how many of us are using 4 pounds of flour and sugar in your cakes at home, right? If you also look close at this, it's also missing milk and eggs. This cake was actually vegan, right? You don't want to take things that might go bad, especially if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, things like eggs and milk and things that will go bad, right? So cakes were made vegan. And I've heard that this cake is really tasty too. So this cake was so massive that they actually had to use the bomb elevator to get it up to the higher decks, right? It's really large too in the middle there. You can see that it's a mini version of Intrepid. And it actually took about a week to make this cake. So it took a really long time. And it was so massive they couldn't just carry it up like a regular cake as well. So now that we've looked at one of the simple jobs on deck, I don't know if it's simple because you're cooking for so many people, but comparing it to places like the flight deck, right, and what might be happening up on there. I said earlier that the flight deck is where you would have airplanes take off and land, right? But we're going to be specifically looking at the island here, and I'll zoom in so that we can see that just a little bit better. The island is where you would find the navigators, you'd find the admiral, and you'd find people like the captain up there as well. The navigators would use equipment like radar. You'd have charts and devices to plot coordinates in here. They're also responsible for making sure that the ship was going in the right direction, right? Looking at the navigator's seat here, you can see that it's enclosed, but you're probably wondering why there's a window off to the right there. Now, this area used to be open, right? And so if you were on the other side of the wall, you'd kind of close up that little hatch to protect you from the elements. But this is one of the few places on the ship that you can actually see the whole starboard side of Intrepid, but from just one area there too. Now, this is also where they would monitor underway replenishment. So not just pilots were sent on that high line, but you'd also have a zip line for bringing back supply or sending supplies out at sea or sending equipment as well. Also located in the island is the pilot's house. So if you can see there, this is where the ship would be steered, right? Using that helm there, it's kind of like a giant steering wheel that turns that rudder. And the person controlling that would be called the helmsman. You would also have the lee helmsman who would actually send a telegraph down to the engine room telling him how fast to go, right? Because that wasn't controlled up at the top. It was actually controlled in the engine room. Now, in the event that this area was taken down during combat, there was actually an identical set of controls located at the end of the ship called secondary con. Now, just below the flight deck, where the captain's second in command would be there ready to take over just in case anything happened, right? There was always a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D, just in case anything like that happened, right? So moving on, you can see here that we've got the captain's chair, right? And if you look off to the left here, you can see that there's kind of like a rear view mirror, right? Where he could observe all the planes landing and all the planes taking off. Now, the captain was responsible for all 3,200 men on board, and around 31 captains served on Intrepid during its time in service. So I think that now is a good time to take a question break if we have any questions. Was one person in charge of steering all the time? So no, like I said, there was a helmsman, right? And he wasn't just posted there 24 hours a day just in charge of steering. There was actually 4 helmsmen, and they'd actually take turns. They'd be in about 4-hour shifts so that just one person wasn't in charge of steering constantly all day getting tired. So they'd actually switch off. Good question. How fast could Intrepid travel? So I mentioned earlier that Intrepid could travel at about 40 miles per hour. If anyone drives ships out there, it's about 33 to 44 knots. Cruising speed was about 15 knots or 17 miles per hour. But you're probably thinking, I don't drive a boat or a ship. Can you break this down for me? Yeah. So if you're thinking about 1 knot is equal to 1 nautical mile per hour. 1 nautical mile is equal to 1 minute of latitude. So 1 knot is roughly about 1.15 miles per hour. Good question. Awesome. So we're going to move on. We looked a little bit at the island there, but let's take a look at the flight deck, right? Where our airplanes are taking off and landing. This is the most important part of the ship, but it's also the most dangerous part as well. Without the flight deck, these airplanes couldn't launch and land, and Intrepid would be kind of useless, right? Because that's what it was, that was its main purpose. So runways at airports are thousands of feet long. But like I mentioned at the beginning, Intrepid's only about 913 feet long. Now, of that 900 feet, only about 250 of it was used for landing space, right? So Intrepid would use these steam catapults, and basically the steam was generated and the engine would be compressed, and these airplanes would actually be slingshotted off the top of the Intrepid. Basically, these pilots would bring their planes to full power, and they'd be launched off. It's called the cat shot, and they basically go from 0 to 150 miles per hour in just 2 seconds. So extremely fast in a very short amount of time. Now, that's just taking off. Landing on Intrepid was also just as difficult, right? Oops, skip that one. There we go. So as these planes are coming out, right, there was a lot of coming back in, there were a lot of preparations. So you'd have the landing signal officer here that would put up his windscreen behind him, and he'd actually have these colored paddles, and he'd be in charge of kind of guiding the pilot back onto the flight deck. You'd have a green flag that would be waved, signaling that everybody was ready for this plane to come in. And as this pilot's about to land, he's actually going to put down this tail hook. And you can see it a little bit better on the right-hand side there. It's this white and black hook, right? That actually lower that hook down. And what they were trying to do is catch one of those cables on the left there that stretched across the flight deck. Now, they would be coming in really fast on a ship that's going about 40 miles per hour, right? Plus, think about the ship also rocking. So landing is not an easy thing to do. These airplanes would be coming in about 130 miles per hour, and those arresting cables would bring them to a full stop, right? So there is a lot happening on the flight deck, right? And there's not just a landing signal officer and a captain watching, but there is a whole flight deck crew making sure that everything is going according to plan. And everybody has a very specific job and a very specific role on the flight deck. Now, if you've ever been around airplanes, you know that it is extremely loud. Like I said, it's also a very dangerous place on board to be. So a lot of the times these crew members were dressed in different colors to make sure that everybody knew their role and also knew each other's roles as well. So we're going to play a quick game here. And we're going to see if you can guess, based on the color, what this flight crew did. So let me know in the chat, either A or B, which color do you think is in charge of preparing planes for flight? Let me know in the chat if you think it's A, the crew in brown, or B, the crew in white. Which color is in charge of preparing the planes for flight? A or B? So if you would have said A in the chat, you would be correct. The crew in brown. They're the air wing plane captains. right? So they'd be in charge of getting the plane ready to go, making sure that everything was ready. Awesome. Oh, I see a lot of B's in the chat. It was B, it was A. Awesome. So next question, this one might be a little bit easier, right? Which team do you think is responsible for refueling? So looking at these pictures here, which group do you think is in charge of refueling? Now, most of the flight deck crew, they didn't just have one job, but they had a lot of little jobs. So they'd have their main job and then a lot of little jobs. This is the only job that had just one job. So let me know which group is in charge of refueling. I see a lot of B's in the chat. This group also had the nickname, the Grapes. That might help some of us out if we're having a difficult time. If you said B, you would have been correct. B was in charge of refueling. They're responsible for making sure that these planes were refueled and ready to get back into the air as fast as possible. The crew on the left, the red team or the red shirts or the crew in red, right, were the ordnance handlers. They were the crash and salvage crew, and they were in charge of disposing explosives and ammo, but they were also the firefighters on the ship as well. Awesome. Next one, which group here, which colored team do you think is in charge of the catapults and the arresting gear? Catapults and the arresting gear. Let me know in the chat. Do you think it's A, the blue, or B, the green, the crew in green? And the catapult and arresting gear officers were also in charge of cargo handling. They were hook runners, and they were also helicopter landing signalers. So let me know in the chat. So I see a lot of us in the chat saying B. B is correct. So green, like I said, they were in charge of the catapult and arresting gear. They were also cargo handlers. They were hook runners and helicopter landing signalers. So good job. The team on the left, the blue team, were they were coordinated communication between the flight deck and flight control. They were also aircraft elevator operators. So when airplanes were needed to be transported to the top of the flight deck, they'd use this giant aircraft elevator to get them up there. And they were also trainee plane handlers as well. All right, I think I have one more. Which job do you think is the aircraft handling officer? Let me know in the chat. Aircraft handling officer. They were also in charge of guiding the pilot on the flight deck and directing the planes. So let me know in the chat, which one, A or B? Yes, I'm seeing a lot of A's coming in. That is correct. So yeah, yellow was in charge of guiding the planes and directing the planes too as well. All right, so I think that was my last one. Do we have any questions? What happens if a pilot misses the cable? So that is called a bolter. And basically these pilots are coming in. They have to keep coming in at full speed just in case they miss the cable. They want to keep up that momentum and that thrust. They'd actually have to circle around and do it again until they catch that cable. Good question. Who are the crew in white? Oh, I did forget to mention the crew in white, right? They are landing signal officers. They are also quality assurance crew, but they're also the safety observers too. If you look, they're dressed in white, right? Because they are medical crew as well. Good question. All right, friends. So as you can see, there were many jobs on board of the Intrepid. With 3,000 men, you had everything that you might find in your community, from dentists and doctors, but also things that you probably have never seen, like anchor chain room people, right? Or people that work on the flight deck. So as you can see, there was a lot going on. It was basically a community at sea, and things that you could find around your community, you'd also find on board Intrepid. So thank you so much for joining me today. The museum has introduced a number of live stream programs. So if you'd like to find out more about those, you can visit our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or subscribe to our channel. Our next program is going to be this Thursday, May 27th at 3 p.m. It's Biome Away from Home. You can come and explore the potential places and planets that you might find life on in outer space. The museum is open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., where you can come and check out some of this awesome aircraft that we talked about today. We also have a submarine, the Growler, as well as the Space Shuttle Enterprise. Now, we also have a quick survey that we'd love to hear your thoughts, located in the chat as well, or in the comments. So again, my name is Kara, and thank you for joining us on another Intrepid adventure.